Hi, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Donya Williams. Hello on this very beautiful fall Sunday. How are you guys today?
Hope you all are well at home. And as always, thank you so much for spending the next hour with us. And we're just going to get straight in. So, today we're going to be talking about Black cemeteries with Dr. Antionette Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and at the University of South Florida, and that's in Tampa, and she's the director of the UCF Heritage Research Lab. She's an applied cultural anthropologist with an interest in heritage research and resource management. Her work challenges theoretical canons that fix people in discrete categories, and she continuously seeks ways of applying anthropology critically and in the service of people, families, and communities, both within and without the Academy. Dr. Jackson is also the founder and director of the Black Cemetery Network, which we'll find out more about today. And as we know, Black cemeteries are probably more likely to be abandoned, lost, forgotten, and erased. So, needless to say, Donnie and I are really looking forward to this conversation, and welcome to the show, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be on and have this conversation. So thank you for inviting me.
This conversation was so important to me because I my family were church founders in several parts of both South Carolina and here in the Washington D.C. area, and there's cemeteries attached. And I even have one ancestor who actually placed himself back into a type of slavery so that the land for that both church and the cemetery could be purchased. So I just feel like this is something that everybody needs to know about. So thank you so much for
Mhm,
coming.
Thank you.
mhm.
Yeah.
And just a little further to what Donnie was saying, you heard her correctly. This is to the audience. He signed what he referred to as an indentured slave deed, basically.
Yeah,
So
he
Yeah.
that
did.
that is how important it was to him. So basically, Dr. Jackson, and for the audience, what Donnie and I are really hoping to kind of get across to them at the end of the show was, to really have a conversation about what the state is of these sites, kind of currently around the nation, and kind of what we can expect in the future. So I just wanted to start the ball rolling by asking, how did you become a champion for Black cemeteries, and what was it about this work that really drew you in?
Yeah. Thank you again for inviting me. And hello, everyone. Uh, there are so many people who have been doing this work for so long. So I'm not, saying that I'm the only one or the first one or anything like that. It's just, I think, the culmination of the moment, especially here in Florida. When I became involved in the project, we were talking in Florida in 2019. There were lots of discoveries in the Tampa Bay area of cemeteries being found under housing complexes, under highways, under school parking lots, and it just became, really part of the local and actually national news in Florida. And I was thinking to myself, why is it that we would be just now knowing that there are like cemeteries with over 700 people buried in them, and we just find out in 2019 again when they're doing redevelopment that, oh yeah, that was a cemetery. So it became just, such a major conversation in Florida. And around that time, 2020, George Floyd was murdered, and our school, University of South Florida, put out a call to action for projects, to fund projects where people would be focused on things that were of interest to people in the community, and to connect the university more closely to issues, important to Black people and communities that surrounded the campus. And again, like I said, I was hearing all this discussion and all these things in the news about these cemeteries being found in Tampa. So I said, I wanted to form and formed a team that would look into what does that mean today? What does finding those cemeteries mean for people who are living in these, for example, in the housing complex that sits on top of a cemetery? What does it mean for families and communities that are associated and connected with those cemeteries? So looking at it from as a cultural anthropologist, from a living people and communities perspective, that drove me to start the what we call the African American Burial Ground Project, and then offshoot of that, looking at it on a national level, I started the Black Cemetery Network to have not only these conversations in Florida and bring emphasis on these living people and communities in Florida, but be part of the national story. Because as I started doing work in Florida, I started seeing and hearing, becoming very conscious of all the things that were going on around the country, and wanted to make sure that we were plugged into that conversation, and also, showcase that this was not just one place, one city, one state, but it was a national story, and that we needed to hear from living people and families and communities. So to put that part into the conversation was a big driver for me, and that's what the Black Cemetery Network is about: is that grassroots involvement of people and living people and families and communities.
Mhm. Can you talk a little bit about when the Black Cemetery Network began and what kind of information can people find on the website?
Yeah, the Black Cemetery Network began in June last year, about 1 year ago, in June 2021. Again, it started with conversations with people in the Tampa Bay area, people who are working on cemetery projects in the Tampa Bay area. It started out with about 11 cemeteries, and today it's at 69. And
Mm.
so started with like I said, Tampa Bay, and then work with the African American Cemetery Coalition in North Carolina as kind of like test sites, or sites that would put cemeteries in the network, submit their cemeteries that they were working on to the network, to start to populate the network and make people aware of the stories and issues that were facing individual cemeteries and or in specific states. So 2021, like I said, started with about 11, and it's just steadily been growing as people, learn more about it and understand again that they're not isolated. It's not an isolated problem to them, and wanting to be part of this national narrative and share their stories. So,
Okay.
yeah, that's when it started.
Will there eventually be like a national repository where all of this information is kind of kept under one umbrella?
Well, right now, when I was thinking about the Black Cemetery Network and starting it, it was also in conversation with the federal discussion and legislation that's being formulated about, how do we do this on a national level and a more formal level through the National Park Service and things like that. So one of the things that they were proposing was to create a national database, and as part of the preservation effort. But sometimes these things take a while, and that's why I said we don't need to wait necessarily for the legislation. We can start building the database right now, and that's what drove me, because I think this is so important that we need to have particular cemeteries, particular people, faces to the problem, to the problem and to the issue. And so building the network first, in front of the legislation, and eventually in conjunction with that. So we'll see, what the handoffs will be, and it'll, once the legislation is passed, what kind of resources will be available, and how the database can sync with whatever else is going on. But right now it is an archive. The database is an archive of sites of people who have cemeteries across the country, and that they submit to the network. So it is an archive that's growing. And again, like I said, so those records and those things will be available as other kinds of legislations or whatever roll out. So, but like I said, no need to wait. We have a problem right now that we need to highlight.
Well, as genealogists, I mean, Donnie and I will just know that information would be invaluable. That
Mhm.
would be yet another resource that African Americans can go to see if there's a burial record for their ancestors.
Yeah, now the burial records, that's true. So I call the Black Cemetery Network a front porch, because people who submit their site, they submit links and information about their site to the network, and that is all public record. You can go out on the Black Cemetery Network, click on any site, and see what information is there, and from there, that people have entered, and from there you can connect with the direct, the people who are working on that site, and maybe coordinate with them. Maybe they need some. One of the things also that the network does is serve as a communication point, a connecting,
Mhm.
a facilitator of conversations across the board for people doing different things. So if you see a site, sometimes people do need genealogical support around what they're doing. Sometimes they need archaeological support, or and things like that. So you can go out there, people who are interested in some place right around where they are, or the site is interested in maybe talking to another site and say, how did you do that? And those kinds of conversations start through the network. So the network facilitates conversations and connections with people who are actually working on those cemeteries. So that is one of the other benefits of the network.
Because that is one of the challenges when it comes to genealogy is getting those death dates. And the
Mhm.
frustrating thing is, I mean, I can think of clients that I work for, and their ancestry's history in terms of taxes and
Yeah.
census records and all that stuff is really good. But when it comes to where they're buried, you go onto Billion Graves or Find a Grave. You try to find the out, and you know they're going to be buried in a black cemetery or they're going to be buried in the black section of a cemetery, and there's nothing.
Yes.
Right.
There's not even the name. There's
Yes.
not even a
Yes.
name of this of a black cemetery sometimes at all. And like I said,
Yes.
you know they're buried somewhere. You know where they lived. You know where they died. But to
Hmm.
find their last burial place is just really frustrating.
And that's the thing, people voluntarily entering, cemeteries that are in their area onto the network. So that is helping at least identify that there was a cemetery in that area. And I've
Hmm.
had people from other universities or uh, schools, K through 12 schools, use the network to do some of that legwork. So they may see that there's a cemetery there, and they start figuring out how to do some of that genealogical research or some of the census data research to help support people who are working on those cemeteries, because again, it's a lot of times there are, very small amount of people that are chartered with trying to do all the work to understand who is buried there or maintain a cemetery, period. So again, this visibility helps people to get this, maybe get some additional help. And like I said, a lot of people contact me and say, how can we help? What site needs, what kind of support, or how can you link us to a site that may need some support? So, and finding out about you all, or again, in that kind of work, I think this is a good connection, because people will have the cemetery network, and they have you all as a resource for actually doing that, as you said, painstaking genealogical legwork.
And again, it wasn't until we started doing this work that we realized that there were different kinds of cemeteries, and this regardless of what ethnicity your ancestors were. The fact that they could be buried on a plantation, it could be a family, a small family or a
Yes,
small
yes,
family community cemetery. It could, because again, I think there's not much information about when cemeteries actually happened. I think when Donia wrote the kind of marketing blurb, Donia, you put a date in there. Was it 1860s or 1830s that you said cemeteries as
Oh
we think
yeah,
about?
1830. So basically, what in doing this research and getting ready for this particular show, I actually found a site, and I wish I written it down, but it actually stated that cemeteries as we know them today really didn't start happening until the 1830s.
mm,
So people could have just been buried anywhere,
yes,
before 1830 or wherever they dropped. That's where they were, and that was it. But it wasn't until around the 1830s where you start seeing rows, and it was an
yeah,
organization
yeah.
as far as how cemeteries were placed together.
Mhm. So I guess in terms of the network itself, I mean, what different kinds of cemetery sites are people actually letting you know about?
Yeah, it's a range. And so one of the beauties of just kind of clicking on the different sites on the network, you can see it, just as you all were describing, the range of sites that are out there. Some were maybe from a convict leasing facility in Texas, where people who were imprisoned were buried, who did a lot of the labor in a convict leasing system. Or there are church cemeteries where, again, um, they had burial grounds behind the church or connected to the church. There are actually physical grave sites that Black folk bought in the 1920s or early 1900s during segregation, in order to have a proper place to bury their loved ones. So some of them are larger sites where people specifically set them up. and created a space for their loved ones that, again, records get lost or conveniently lost by the city, and because to acquire this land, and black cemeteries end up being the ones that, developed over, or the land is taken for some other use. So highways and those kinds of things. So it's a range, and it may be, again, small private cemeteries, or, like I said, larger, church ones, or larger, like, cemeteries that people set up particularly to address the issue of segregation, where black folk couldn't be buried in other white only cemetery spaces. So it's a range of things. So it's a range of numbers of people. It may be a couple people taking care of a site. It could be a larger friends of the cemetery taking care of the site, or it could be some that are under maybe national the or state jurisdiction that are being taken care of. But for the most part, most of the cemeteries on there are sites that people are in some way dealing with on their own, either with a friends group or their own individual family, or their small other resources that they're using, which again is why the national legislation would be important
Okay.
for that
So
funding.
if I was at home,
Mhm.
what would be the best way for someone like me to research whether there was a black cemetery in the area where I lived?
Well, the first thing, if you were at home just looking at this and you're like, wait, I'm interested in this, go out to I would say just start out going out to the Black Cemetery Network, kind of seeing if it's any cemetery in your state or in your city already that's already listed on the network, and kind of, uh, you know, then maybe connect with those folk, or at least read about what they're doing and how they did the work in in the area that may be closest to you. But anywhere, I would say start out with a local black church, historically African American church, and connect with them, and have communications about the history of the church, and maybe where their burials were, or what the burial practices and things like that were for that community. And oftentimes maybe the church has moved, but they have the history of it being, the cemetery being located in some other place within the city before they moved. And that's been often the case, that many of the former residents of a community, African American communities, had to move. And cemeteries are not those kinds of things that you just pick up and move a cemetery. So oftentimes the cemetery was separated from the community that originally established it. So
I'm wondering if
That
old maps. I'm wondering if old
yes,
maps would
yes,
help.
yes, exactly. Old historical maps kind of identify where there were colored cemeteries or black cemeteries or things like that. So that's one. Oral histories, again, like I said, a lot of times people have been, talking about that, but now with the ground penetrating radar and the archaeological technology to support people, conversations that they might have been saying, look, this is a cemetery, this is a cemetery, we know that this has been a cemetery for throughout our history here, and people are like not quite listening. But when you couple that with, sometimes people need something else, and you couple that with the ground penetrating radar, sometimes then people are like, oh right, there, yep, there are burials there. And suddenly the conversation gets escalated to a different level than it might have had prior to that.
well, I'm one of the things that brought us to this, like I was saying earlier, how my particular family I know is very much involved in black cemeteries and churches and things of that nature, but not all cemeteries are connected to churches.
Yes. Hmm.
And sometimes they're connected directly to the community itself.
Hmm.
So Brian and I was actually talking about this, is when the community dies, does the cemetery die? What happens to that? And how do we, because reason why I'm saying this, even though Brian and I were discussing this, there's actually another reason why I'm saying it, and it's because there was these two young boys who did this particular project, in school, and they ended up
Oh, right.
they kept riding a
Yes,
past
yes.
this church here in.
Yes, I saw.
So
Yes,
you know what I'm talking about.
yes,
It
I
was here
do.
in
I
the
know that
Maryland
story.
area.
Hmm.
Brian, I don't know if I even shared this with you, but here in
Mm.
Maryland, there was these two young boys, and they kept riding past this old church, and they didn't know anything about it and what was going on. And one thing led to another. Not only did the church have a cemetery in the background, but the church was the center of an entire community that had now been gated up and closed away. And no one knew about it except for the people that were descendants of it. And these were African Americans that were descendants of this particular area. And now these two young boys have brought all of this back to life. Now people are working with it and doing things and trying to figure all this out. What is it that we have to do to start making sure that we are bringing ourselves back to life, that we are doing what is necessary? I get really tired of folks saying we need to control our narrative when we're very, very quiet about it. How can we control our narrative when we're not doing what we're supposed to do anyway?
Like I said, I think well, cemeteries are very much place based. So really, typically there was a church, a historically probably African American community in a segregated sections of town where Black folk were living. Obviously, had cemeteries and those kinds of things in those communities. So knowing that is probably the case is one thing. But I think with the George Floyd murder, and people just became tired of waiting for these kinds of conversations to be heard, and I think they pushed the envelope a lot more. And I think uh, it's been a steady, as you can see, when people are always keep saying that this is a cemetery here, this is a cemetery there. I think this has always been the case here in Tampa. Those cemeteries have been there. People knew that they were living over a cemetery, and had been saying that. But again, until again with the GPR and the moment where people are like, we can't, these are systemic issues, these are systemic concerns, and then all of the confluence of things kind of made these kind of conversations that Black people were having about these sites and places, just more important for people to act upon and not ignore it. Because as redevelopment is happening again, like the cycle of redevelopment where people should have done due diligence and identified these places as having cemeteries by doing the GPR kind of work in these sites before you redevelop, or looking at old maps and things like that. They kind of just ignored it, because again, in the prior to segregation, I mean, prior to integration and things like that, people didn't really, give credence to Black folks claims and lands and that kind of thing. So that was a problem. But as this redevelopment is happening again, no one is allowing that kind of silence around these sites, and yet people are now doing the due diligence that they need and should have done the first time around, and have to act upon this because the communities are not letting them just slide by when they know that there are cemeteries there. So I agree that there's been a level of silence for even amongst people who cites those Black folks, African Americans. But I really think that it was only a silence that people didn't want to hear and didn't want to act upon it in the official, in the legislation, or in the state. The people in charge of things were not listening, and I think this is a new day where people are in power. The people in power are also people who are listening to and can't ignore those kinds of things that people in communities are bringing forward. So like I said, it's a confluence of things. People, you know the right people in the positions of power, or the people in positions of power in a situation where they can't let it just go under the rug, which has often been the case. And I don't think people just were silent. Nobody cared, but nobody acted upon it when
Okay.
they reported it. In a many,
And
I'm speaking of some of the cases I know of here in Florida.
Mhm.
There are a
People.
lot of cases in Florida too. I noticed that.
Mm,
Yes,
yeah,
There's a
yes,
lot.
we
I came across some of those on YouTube. There's a
yeah,
town,
it's terrible. Yeah,
Lemon
no,
something town. But
yeah.
listen, there's some excellent questions coming in. Donnie, I'm going to take D Turner's question first. Maybe you want to
Okay.
take the next one. So it's a two-parter. I'm going to take the second part. But Dr. Jackson, is there a registry of Black-owned undertakers?
I personally don't know of the registry, but I would not be surprised that if there's not a Black Undertaker Association and they have some kind of resources that they're using.
Hmm.
I don't personally know about it, but that is one good thing about that question is not only are we talking about cemeteries, we're talking about all of the kinds of infrastructure around the cemetery. Funeral homes and undertakers and all those kinds of people that are, would be good resources. And we actually interview those kinds of folk when we are doing the work around the cemeteries that I'm
Hmm.
working specifically on. Those are people we talk to find out more. So
Okay,
that's
so
a great question.
my advice to D then would be to do research in local or county newspaper, sorry, African American or Black newspapers in the area or the region that you live to see who the big undertakers were. Would
Mhm.
be my advice on that one. She also asked about old repositories of obituary notices. I'm going to field that one first.
Mhm.
As with all parts of America, Black people on the whole did not tend to get obituaries until, depending on where you lived, I'm thinking of South Carolina and Virginia, North
Mhm.
Carolina at the moment, till about the late 60s, early 70s. Before that, from my genealogical experience, basically the Black people who got obituaries before the Civil Rights Movement, you had to be a good Negro, usually a church or civics leader,
Yeah.
or if you did something unusual, like live to be, usually if you were over 100 when you died, or when you turned 100, you would get an article, but kind of things like that. So Donnie and I can say from our own experience, I mean, we have a huge family in Edgefield, South Carolina. Those who died after slavery, but before the 1960s, we don't have many obits for them.
Not many. We might
Not
have a
really.
few. We might have a few in the 50s, in the late mid to late 50s. Um, I think we probably, if we went to look, we could probably count on one hand any before mid 50s.
And most of those were reverends.
Right. But I think it did, like Brian said, it definitely depends on where you are. And then also it depends on how racist the area was as well, because if they thought nothing of you, I don't care if you are 100, it wasn't going to, they wasn't going to say anything to you. So I think it kind of depends on that too. But
Yeah, and it also, like you said, the Black newspapers are the best source of any kind of record
yeah.
keeping or announcements about anything like that. And then the second thing is without the obits, we've been collecting funeral programs and things like that. So that is another record that. But again, a lot of this is slow going because obviously you have to, work with individual people or maybe churches sometimes maybe collected that kept those kind of funeral programs in their own historical archives and things like that. So you have to physically, kind of probably go back to the particular church and see what records they have. But as you talk to people, if you can get any kind of funeral programs and of course Bibles and all those kinds of things where people kept records, that is a way to get that information for Black folk.
Right, right.
Donnie, did you
Um,
want to take more Tars question? I think you put it up on the screen. So many of these Black cemeteries are run.
I don't see that one. I don't have it in the start section. So if you see it, go ahead.
Okay. So one of our audience members, Moore, said so many of these Black cemeteries are run by a church in the area, which we've been discussing. Often there, and this is the crux of it, often there is no website, office, or listed contact person. What are some of the ways that people can get around that lack of information?
Well, I guess since the topic is the Black Cemetery Network, I think that's one of the beauties of having the network, because oftentimes the network does list a church or churches that are in the associated with doing some of the work with those the particular cemeteries that are on the website or on the in the archive. So um, again, for and as you all know, because you're researchers yourself, this is groundwork that Black folk we have to do to collect this information, and it takes a lot of legwork. So often we're building our archives and creating repositories as the Black Cemetery or whatever repository some of the undertakers and those kinds of things. We have to build those archives. And you're not going to just open up a place and find all these lists of things typically, because of all of the things with segregation or you know uh, lack of having resources to do that. But we're now really at a point, I think, where we have the resources and the time and the focus to do this. So we have to build our archives, and that's what we're doing. And I'm really excited about it. But it takes a lot of work, and it takes a long time to build these archives. And so that is a very important part of the work. All of us need to be doing, and then link those archives together. So that's
Okay.
where we
Yeah.
are. We're building.
So Tor has a part two. They make the point cemeteries require regular maintenance. So
Mm.
if we're talking about a black cemetery that's just been found, it's in a poor state of repair, what civic body is there a guidebook or is there guidance or a playbook that can step people through how to get a civic body invested into repairing it, preserving it, restoring it?
Yeah, I mean, for it's like a state by state or city by city. So I would start with your city, your municipality, to see what resources they may have available in their legislative body to deal with cemeteries. And then look at again, maybe some states have particular preservation offices that have that kind of information for a state. And again, if that's not there, then again, go again looking at either at the Black Cemetery Network or other efforts that are going on throughout the country, and then connect with those folk and ask. But usually there is a preservation. I would start with the preservation office uh, in their city or state, and see what resources are available there. And then if there are people working, if you find other people working on sites in your state through the Black Cemetery Network or something like that, maybe reach out and connect with them and ask about the particular resources for that state or that area. And hopefully, the national legislation will make that a lot easier in creating a space where people can have one, at least a central point of contact for that.
There's another question by Brenda Browder. She said, "How difficult is it to get ground penetration at a burial site at a site designated as a national site?"
Designated as a national site.
Yeah,
I don't know what they mean by national site, except for maybe I mean designated as state
I
cemetery.
think she wants to be wanted to be recognized as historical, because someone
Oh,
else has placed
okay.
a question similar to that. Just asking about making something historical. Like, for example, the church that my family founded, one of the churches in Edgefield, was done in 1867. The church itself, the graveyard has always been attached to it. Would that be something that we could look at as making it a historical area? And then does that making it historical, does that make the state then become somewhat making sure that it's taken care of in if something happens to the church itself,
Yeah.
to
So
keep it
yeah. So
moving?
it's probably yeah. It's probably several steps to that. To if it hasn't been designated as any type of a historic site, the first thing would be to collect the information and submit those things to the state, or if it's you trying to get state recognition, then to the state preservation office according to the criteria that they have. Now, to get ground penetrating radar and things like that, you know in Florida, we have a public archaeology network, and it's called the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and that's a state-run um, body that will consult with people and who find cemeteries or have questions about them, and record those kinds of things in the state database. So if sometimes they have resources to actually do a ground penetrating radar survey, or maybe work with the cemetery or the church or whoever to help raise money, or figure out a way to facilitate something like that, and maybe get some funding from some elsewhere. So uh, it's hard to say, but it's on the state. Each state has their criteria for being designated as a historic site, or each city, if you're talking about that, have the criteria. But yeah, the ground penetrating radar, that's, again, that would be something that, depending on your state, if they have public archaeologists that are willing to take on that project for your particular site, I would look around, maybe at a local university near you with archaeologists and things like that, and see if that's a project maybe that they would want to take on, and help with, and be, it would be less expensive if they took it on as a research
Mhm.
project or something like that. um, but like I said, more and more states are having funding, or grants that you go for, perhaps, to at least do the research on that
Yep.
cemetery.
And before I get to Adrian Fike's question, which is another excellent question, Don, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to kind of show the audience just a couple of different examples of what we're talking about. Donnie, if you wouldn't mind pulling up that Washington, D.C. headstone article. So they're all different kinds of, really kind of busting loose in terms of getting people to think of different iterations of what a Black cemetery is. So for instance, Patrick Henry's Red Hill, again, it's my ancestor, they've only relatively recently found where the enslaved people were buried. And they've actually made it so that you don't even have to go through the plantation proper to get to it. They've either just finished or they're almost finished with an access way. So anyone who's a descendant of an enslaved person who's buried there can just go down a separate path right into to where the enslaved people are buried. But again, that's relatively recently. That's an example of a plantation. So we have Tulsa, Oklahoma,
Yeah.
after the massacre. They've really put a concerted effort to figuring out where those mass graves are, where they were and where they are. We've got Central Park. There used to be a black village called Seneca Village, which got destroyed to build part of Central Park. They've found a couple of graves there too. So there's no doubt, people live there. We're talking about the relationship between Black communities and Black cemeteries. There's one, Seneca Village, gone. Think about Beacon Hill in Boston. As wealthy as that place is today, that started off as a Black neighborhood for a long time before the Black people got moved out. Well, their ancestors are buried somewhere in Beacon Hill as well. And then Donnie's brought up this story. Now, this is a cemetery that was built for free people of color back in the early 1800s in DC, flourished for however long it did before there was financial issues. And then someone got the bright idea to take the headstones. I think they moved the bodies somewhere else, but rather than keep the headstones, they threw them into the Potomac. And then again, within the modern time frame, I think there was a couple of really bad storms. Those tombstones started eventually washing up along the banks of the Potomac. And thankfully, the landowner had a soul and a heart, and rather than just destroy them or get rid of them, he preserved them. And this is back when Northam was governor of Virginia, so he got involved, a senator got involved, and they're doing a really, really good job of kind of dredging the Potomac for the rest of these missing tombstones. But that's what they did. They just took the tombstones, threw them in the river. So that's one example of, that's an example of erasure, I'm going to say, because we're talking about 4 ways that these things happen. Cemetery gets abandoned, lost, forgotten, or erased. If you can bring up the story about Teresa Vega. So Teresa Vega is a genealogist and a historian. She's good friend of both Donnie and I. This is the other extreme. She had an ancestor, a black ancestor in Connecticut, and herself and a handful of other people, it took them 10 years to be able to get the right to access their ancestors' graves, which admittedly are on private property. But that was a long, long, difficult, bitter court fight to be able to get access to, again, that. I hate calling it a forgotten cemetery because it was actually on the property map. People knew there was a black cemetery there. They just didn't want to grant people access to it. Um, Actually, if you have any advice about how people, about private cemetery ownership, is that something that like the collection of black cemetery networks are working on to be able to give people the right to pay homage to their ancestors, even if it is on private land?
Well, the Black Cemetery Network has sites in there that are on private land that people are working on and trying to preserve, even in having issues with access with the landowners. So that is a big concern with many of these sites. That even the legislation that's being passed is focused on not necessarily focused on private lands at this point, allowing access to private lands, which is something that will eventually have to be done. So that is a concern. How do you deal with private land ownership? So that's something that everybody, people who are working on these problems, are pushing with the legislation to make sure that those people don't lose sight of the fact that having access to these sites on private land is important, and being able to protect and honor people who are buried on what is now private land. So it is a very big issue.
Which leads me to Adrian's question: how are African American cemetery groups connecting, collaborating, and advocating together on issues like the Burial Grounds Preservation Act?
Yeah, that's what there are lots of organizations, regional organizations or coalitions across the country who are, you know, looking at the legislation, providing input to the people putting the legislation together, and really being very active in uh, conscious about what they want, or what even I want to see in that type of legislation. So people in these African American coalition of African American cemeteries. We have one in Tampa Bay. I know North Carolina has one with Deborah Gonzalez, and all those folk are really paying a lot of attention and very vocal and active in putting together in putting together input for that legislation. So um, it is an ongoing conversation, and people again are watching and are very active in that aspect of it.
Let me
So it's
tell you, I am so just excited about these comments because they're just sharing all the different places as to what they're doing and where they are. It makes my heart just kind of melt because of the question that I asked earlier. Like, we don't get involved, but apparently we
Yes,
do. It's
that,
just not being put out there. So you guys, I'm so proud of hearing all of this. This is just really, really awesome to hear.
yeah. And if any, I can't see the sites you're talking about, but like I said, it's 69 sites, and continually people are continually sending things into the Black Cemetery Network. So any of folk out there who are listing the sites that I'm not quite seeing right now, please submit them, because people go to that website. That's a public archive, and you can see what other people are doing across the country, and that's one place to put them, so that there, we call it strength in numbers, so people see what's going on across the country. So any of those things that people are putting, that if you haven't submitted to the Black Cemetery Network, please, it's an open invitation to go ahead and send, log in blackcemeterynetwork.org, and their instructions of how to submit your site. So looking forward to that. And that's what I said, Donia, that we were really it. I know people are doing things because they are always connecting, asking questions, and sending things in. The site is growing, growing, growing. So people are really on board.
have you,
Wow.
or has the Black Cemeteries Network thought about You probably have, working with African American history and genealogical societies like OGS, or the Sons and Daughters of the Middle Passage, groups that are already collecting or gathering other really important information about African American history. And specifically OGS, thinking about how many different chapters there are across the
Mhm.
nation, may very well have that kind of regional knowledge of Black cemeteries.
Yeah, and that's the first of all, the Black Cemetery Network is not static. We're continually add resources. One of the things that we want to do is be a resource for other folk, like you just mentioned, the genealogy societies and groups, maybe some archaeological groups and things like that, to put those people in conversation on the network as well. So right now,
Mm.
we basically have the cemeteries, but all of the other kinds of organizations that you're talking about want to have that listed or invite people to list those sites on the network as well, so that people doing the work can figure out people who are really interested in supporting them in that work, how to connect. So yes, that is another phase and level of the Black Cemetery Network, to include and add those kinds of things that people are asking about. So yes, it will be a repository for that kind of information as well.
Because thinking about it, these cemeteries can be anywhere. Again,
Mhm.
saw a clip on YouTube, Florida, funnily enough, town had the
Mhm.
word lemon in it.
Yeah,
Lemonville, Lemontown, Lemon
and
something.
down in Miami, yes.
hmm And these guys were. It looked like they were just taking a nice autumn walk in the woods, covered with leaves, twigs, everything else. You would have never thought there was a cemetery, but they're walking with a stick. One, I think, for snakes and gators, but also they were testing for where the tombstones were. And then they would hit something, they'd hear it, and then they would take a brush and they would just very gently brush the debris away. There's massive tombstones and headstones and all the
Mhm.
rest of it. Honestly, if you were just going for a walk in the woods, you would think that was all that was there. That
Yeah,
you were
yeah.
not literally in the middle of a cemetery.
Hmm.
Yeah, I saw one also on YouTube in Tampa, Tampa Bay, where it's an organization, a company that's sitting right on it, and they had no idea. I think the company Crumb
Yeah,
has
no,
something.
that's in Clearwater, Florida. It's a St.
Yes,
Matthew's
yes.
Baptist Church. And again, they're on the network, so that you can see their story out there. But yes, right now it's a business sitting on it, and it's also a school sitting on what
Uh-huh.
the original site. So, and right now it's a business on where it was moved to. So as you can see, we're seeing in Florida, at least in just the Tampa Bay area, is multiple levels of erasure.
Right.
One of the sites that I'm working on is sitting under the parking lot of Tropicana Field, which is a baseball field under the parking lot. Before that, that area was, they had a housing complex there. Before that, you know, then the interstate, and then the housing and those kinds of things. Just multiple layers of erasure. And now that they're getting ready to redevelop Tropicana Field, this whole conversation is back on the table. Like, now what do we do now that we know for sure that these cemeteries were originally there before the highway, before the parking lot, before the housing complex? Now, going forward, what are we going to do? What are you going to
Well,
do about acknowledging that?
right. And then the other question that I have is, because back on that, the one in Clearwater, Florida, that you were
Mhm.
talking about, um, one of the things that they did, because this was like a newspaper, just was like a news
Yes.
clipping that that I saw on YouTube, and they put the map up
Hmm.
of where the bodies were. These bodies stretched out into the street.
Yes. Yeah.
Does that mean that their bodies are still there?
Yeah, and one awful thing about this is that, or one consistent thing about some of these stories is, okay, they, for some reason, they had the map and they say, oh yeah, it was a cemetery there, but we've moved all the bodies before we built whatever it is XYZ was built. But at the time they go to do the construction, maybe to do something else, they hit upon a body, or the people say that they didn't move all the bodies, and it's usually the case they only moved a few bodies, and the majority of the people are still buried in the site, even though people make an announcement that, oh yeah, we moved those bodies before we started this construction. Again, with the ground penetrating radar and people not being, quiet or silent anymore about this, and demanding that people, really do the due diligence around before they build on a site, or if they're getting ready to rebuild, then they do the due diligence and find out, yeah, these bodies were never moved. And that's been the case in many places throughout Florida, that people said, oh yeah, we moved them all, and they didn't move but maybe a few bodies, and the bulk of them, yeah, remain on the sidewalk, on the parking lot, under whatever was there. They're
Yeah.
still there.
I have a great great grandmother who died in an asylum, and unfortunately, her children did not go and get her, so she was buried in the hospital cemetery. It was an asylum. Even though she died, she it wasn't like she was crazy or anything like that. But that's what they did with black
Yes,
people.
yeah,
They,
yeah, yeah.
instead of placing them in the regular hospital, they put them in an asylum, and she ended up being there. And we now know that there is a baseball field over top of
Hmm.
her.
Yeah.
I don't know if she was moved or not.
Hmm.
So now that I know that, what do I have to do to go and try to figure out, did you move these bodies and
Hmm.
where did you move them?
Yeah. I think especially descendants or people with any kind of direct connection, like, that, have a lot of sway or power in these kind of conversations. So I would go, like I said, to the local city authorities and kind of, you know, state your claim that I have a loved one that was buried here. We don't know, whatever happened to her, and we know that this cemetery was here, and I'm a descendant, and those folk have a lot of rights, in many cases, to really open up these conversations or investigations, or additional, demand additional oversight from the local authorities. So I would go straight go straight to the mayor, go straight to the
Okay,
city
all right.
legislative folk and say, look, I have, if you have the maps, you have the information that you don't know whatever happened to your loved one, but the last you knew, you
Is
probably,
this is where she was, right?
and I'm sure, and you maybe even trigger having the GPR done on that site, because you really want to know, like, are these, bodies still there?
Okay, all
Yeah.
right.
So you having that, you have a lot of power in that kind of conversation, having that descendant, connection.
Wow. Okay. Well,
Uh,
go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say, it just, Donnie and I were talking about this before the show. It just seems like everything has to be a fight and a struggle. That just
Mm,
some things should be morally universal.
Right. Yeah.
And respecting the dead goes pretty much across every kind of ethnic group and civilization out there. What is it about money? What is it about money that just corrupts that?
I think it, I think it's more than just money. I think in the case of Black folk, it's, total disregard
total
to Black
disrespect.
people
Yes.
as being human, or as having those kinds of rights. And up until, more recently, like, really recognizing that those folk were actually, people worthy, or, that should demand that kind of, um, claim to their land, their businesses, their burial grounds. So that's why it's a fight, because it was never ever acknowledged when it first happened that they had any valid rights in the first place. A lot of times when those cemeteries were built, they were, maybe at that point the land wasn't desirable, or wherever people kind of left that section alone, as a segregated area. But oftentimes those were really, they become useful in some other way to people, and they then totally disregard Black folk again in that area, because they need the land, they need the space, they want it for whatever. So I think, yeah, it's a fight now, because you have to. This is why it's systemic, because it was built that way to create,
Mhm.
this unequal relationship and value for particular human beings. So we have to fight now to get that corrected, and
Mhm.
and
Well,
address that, and get our cemeteries the respect. And I think in the present, people now know, again, what you're saying. I think in Florida it's easier to get people involved in this, because, right, people now say, right, dignity for the dead, we can all agree on that, but you still have to go through all the layers of things that got us to this point in the first place.
Mhm.
Mm.
Well, we're a long way in time period. We're a long way away from ancient Egyptians, but it's kind kind of interesting to see that there's still some of those dynamics kicking around. Um, Doretha asked a really good question about location of burials being listed on death certificates. Again, I'm going to say that may depend on where your ancestors were living. Sometimes I've seen that. Sometimes I've just seen it where it's just the name of the undertaker. So then,
Yeah.
and I unfortunately have not been able to find undertaker records. So
But we are like almost out of time, and I can't believe that this went so
your microphone, Dania?
quick. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I was saying we are almost out of time. We're like a minute out. So I just want to this went fast, and
It
I
sure
don't know
did.
if it was because it was just a great conversation, or we had a lot of comments that were very, very both interesting and informative. And Dr. Jackson, it is just an appreciation to you, for starting something like this. And if there is anything that Genealogy Adventures can do to help and get involved, we are definitely
Okay.
open to doing that.
Yeah.
We
Yes.
want to do it. Because I mean, if you can help me get to my great great grandmother, I appreciate it.
Okay.
Because
Yes.
when I tell you I was mad when I found out where she was, I was like, you got to be kidding me. I've
Yeah.
been looking for
Yeah.
this lady. So,
Mhm.
yeah. But
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you so
No.
much for being here and joining us.
Thank you all.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your passion.
Yeah.
And we just shared the link to the site on screen. And unfortunately, we are so out of time, we don't even have time to introduce next week. It's just enough time for us to say to everyone else, well, to say to you, Dr. Jackson, thank you again. And to say a huge thank you to everyone at home who's spent the last almost hour with us. So you can see us right here, as always, Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Yep. I'm
All right.
Danya,
I'm Brian.
and we
Goodbye.
will see you guys next week. Miss Dr. Jackson, you can hold on if you'd like. Bye guys.
Bye bye.